Mr. Nash came to Fort Gibson about 1853, and he was around 16 years of age. He worked at the sutler store with prominent people of the area, and by the time he was 26, he had bought out his employers. Now, he started this house around 1859. This room and the room to my right were the first rooms built. There's a root cellar beneath it. It is dated around 1859. All the woodwork you see in here, even these globes, are original to this house. Now, this part of the house, as I said, was original, but after the Civil War, about 1870, Patrick Byrne, who was the architect sent here by the government to create the fort buildings, designed the rest of the house. And these rooms are 18 by 18, all of the downstairs rooms. Now, this home had a lot of living. The original owner had 11 children, and who were all reared here. His 2 wives both died here. There have been many people who've had supernatural experiences here. I've not had one, but these people have told me of their experiences, and I will relate them to you. This room is known as Nanny's room. There have been 2 supernatural experiences in this room. Our oldest daughter, Cherie, will not sleep in this room. She says, as she was walking through the house one day, she looked in here and saw standing at this door a lady in her night clothes with white hair piled up on her head. Later, a granddaughter came to visit us and asked if we had seen any experiences. It was granddaughter Vivia Nash, 87 I think was her age, and she had been here as a child. And I told her about what my daughter had said, and she said, "Oh, that was Nanny." After Mother died, and that meant the second mother, Nanny came home from school to take care of all of us children. And Daddy told her, meaning Vivia Nash, that if she took care of the children, she would inherit the home. Now, another time, there was an interesting experience. My mother was sleeping here because we wouldn't leave our daughter here alone. She wouldn't sleep here alone. So Mother was sleeping here. My husband and I had been on vacation, and we decided not to sleep on the road. We decided to drive in. So it was between 2 and 3 when we were coming home. We did not call my mother. We called no one. My mother was waiting at the back door when we drove up. And I said, "Mother, why are you here? Why aren't you asleep?" And she said, "Well, honey, 10 or 15 minutes ago, someone came to my bed and touched me and said, 'The kids are coming home.' So I got up and I came to the door, and in a very short time, you drove up to the house." That's the second experience that I can relate to you from what we call Nanny's room. This is the entrance hall to this home. This home, it has a name. It is Rose Lawn because the lawn around here was full of rose bushes, and that's where why it received that particular name. This hallway has had a lot of activity. When we purchased this house in 1996, there was a lot of renovation that had to be done, so we didn't live here for a year. One of the problems we had is that the house had sunk, and so we picked up the house. And when we did, the plaster on this wall cracked. We could see underneath the very thick plaster horsehair and lattice work. But I told my husband that was dangerous, it had to come down. When it came down, we found this wonderful old native stone wall. Now within this wall, where you see these small stones, there were bricks pushed into it. And so we realized to renovate this, we needed to bring in a mason that could do the work. Now, one night he was working here very late because he wanted the masonite, what he was working on, to set, and he was continuing to work on it. But as he worked, he later related to us, something was standing behind him and kept pushing on him, so he could not complete his work. He was rather upset. He left and returned with his wife, who sat at the curve of the stairs so that he could complete the work on the back of this fireplace. There has been a lot of activity on these stairs. One night, my husband and I were sitting in the living room reading, and we had been taking care of our daughter's little Cocker Spaniel. This little dog was so gentle. She never barked, never did anything but want to be petted. But she jumped off of the couch, ran to this lower step, and was out of control, barking and growling and jumping up. Now, I was a little unnerved, and I walked here and I looked, and there was nothing there at the turn of the stairs, but this little dog saw something and could not control itself at whatever it saw. My husband finally had to pick Sammy up and take her away because she would not settle down. One other interesting story has occurred along this hall. We were out by the pool. We had a cookout and a swim, and we had several guests with us. And one of the men wanted to come in to change his clothing. And I said, just go into the bathroom at the back of the house. Well, when he came back out, he stood out on the steps. And wanting to be the good hostess, I walked up to him and asked him, I said, is there a problem? Could you not find a place to change? And he said, Thrissa, is Curtis, who's my husband, playing tricks? And I said, playing tricks? Why? He said, a man with a white beard and white hair walked down the hall in his nightshirt. Now, my husband does have white hair and a white beard, but my husband wasn't in the house, and he certainly didn't wear a nightshirt. But the man insisted that he came out of this room, came down the hall, and entered the bedroom, the back bedroom. Now, if you would like to follow me up these steps, we will go upstairs to where there has been quite a bit of activity. Several of my guests have related experiences that they have had in this room. One night, we had a friend sleeping here because we were out of town, and again, our daughter was sleeping in the back bedroom and would not sleep here alone. So our guest was sleeping in the bed here. And the guest said that she had just turned out the lights when an old man walked through the room. He came around the bed, he walked in front of the armoire and came over here to this table. And I said, what did you do? And she said, I just lay very quietly and watched him. I said, did he threaten you? And she said, no. He just stood staring at the table. I've tried to imagine what was originally in this corner. I am thinking the 11 children that were in this house, that perhaps this was where a child's bed originally was. But that is one of the experiences. Another guest was sleeping here, and I was downstairs in the kitchen, and I heard her running down the stairs, running through the house, and she said, Mrs. Johnson, have you been playing tricks on me? I said, no, I would not do that, and I would not. She said, Miss Johnson, I was lying there asleep. Someone came in the room and sat down on the bed beside me. I felt the bed go down. I rolled over to see who it was, and no one was there. Another time, when this bed was on this particular wall, and my husband and I were sleeping, I heard my husband jump up and scream and yell and start running around the bed, around the room, and he started down the stairs. I was startled, to say the least, and then he ran back up and he said, did you see it? And I said, no, honey, I only saw you running across the room. And he said, Thrissa, something came at me in the night, and that's what I was chasing. It went down the stairs. Now, my daughters, they consider this room the safe room because there's been little activity here. Now, this is where my grandchildren sleep, and just to make sure this room continues to be safe, I have a guardian angel that hung over my bed as a child. But we believe this room was probably the nursery, a small room on the south. It would have been very warm. But when our daughter was in high school, she was in bed reading, and she said, suddenly the cabinet door opened, and she came running down the stairs thinking that I had something to do with it, as if I can create these supernatural moments. I haven't had any experiences here really. Now, this bed is well over 100 years old. This belonged to my grandparents, so there's lots of memories in this room. But the only experience I have had in this room is one night before we moved in here. I was alone. My husband was the principal, and he was at the high school because there was a ball game night, and my daughters were there. So I was alone in this big house. I was scraping wallpaper off the ceiling, and I was on a ladder. I heard someone walking downstairs on the wooden floors, thinking one of the daughters had returned. I yelled, "I'm up here!" But no one came up the steps. And so I thought, well, I'm hearing things. A little bit later, I heard the walking again, and again I said, "Did you not hear me? I'm up here in the back bedroom upstairs." No one returned. Finally, it did puzzle me, and so I walked back downstairs and went through the house. The doors were locked, and no one was there. Rose Lawn was constructed out of the lumber from Riley's Chapel, which was one of the first houses of worship at Park Hill, which is near Tahlequah, and was the original place where the Cherokee aristocrats settled. Now, the history books tell us that Florian Nash, when he wanted lumber for this house, went to Tahlequah, bought the lumber that had been gathered after a portion of Riley's Chapel had burned. It was brought here, and he put it in this house. Now, there are places in the house where you can actually see some scorched boards from that fire in Riley's Chapel at Park Hill. Now, This room is a perfect example of a Victorian parlor. The history books discuss this old walnut fireplace, and at the other end are the bay windows. French doors on the room led out to the porch because this was a French country home. One of the most interesting features of this room, though, is the ceiling. These are the original boards, which we have left because we know they're of historical significance. My daughters have been a little bit fearful of this room, knowing that these boards witness the many, many funerals of the people in that area that had their last services in Riley Chapel. A couple of interesting things have occurred in this room. One evening, our children, our daughters, and their cousins, who were all young adults at the time, decided on an autumn evening to bring a Ouija board and play the game. Now, they were sitting about right here, gathered around the Ouija, and I had warned them, the Ouija board is nothing to trifle with, but they were all mature young people. So they began to play the game. Now, there's another bit of history perhaps you should know about this room. For a period of time, this room was used as the master bedroom. Mr. Nash married Fanny Ross Van, granddaughter Lewis Van, treasurer of the Cherokees, and her other grandfather was Rich Joe Van, who owned a big plantation near Weather Falls of historical interest. And they were married about 10 years. And after the Civil War, after they were taken prisoner and returned here, they finished this home, and this was where the master bedroom was. They married in 1863, and Fanny died in 1873 at the age of 28. He married again in 1874, Lucy Morgan Rogers Nash, another very historical lady. Her grandfather was the governor of Tennessee. And they were married 16 years. Again, we had the master bedroom here. And she died 16 years later in 1890. Mr. Nash died in 1920. Another death in this home was little Clarence, who died at the age of 2. Another family member was Harry, who was born in 1866 and died in 1899. Now, I don't know that Harry died here, but I know his name is written on many of the windows. So those are the deaths we know from the family. Now, back to the Ouija board. These young adults in my family were playing Ouija, and one of them said, "Ask it if there are any ghosts in Rosemont." And the Ouija began to move quickly, and it began to say, there are 3 ghosts in this room with you. The young people were startled. One began to cry. One began to say, "Auntie Ann, I'm afraid. I'm a Christian. What am I doing?" And I said, "Take your hand off the Ouija then." So that is a story which had a big impact on the young people who come to this home. Many people will not sleep in my home. Many people will not sleep in certain rooms of my home because they truly believe that Roselawn is a haunted house. Gibson has a national cemetery that was established in 1869. And near the entrance of the cemetery, there are grave sites arranged in a circle, and every person in that circle has a wonderful story. But probably the grave of most interest and greatest mystery is the grave of Vivia. Only her name is on the stone, and it is engraved, it's cut into it. According to one of the legends, Vivia was a young woman from a very prominent, well-to-do family in Boston. There was a young officer who came through Boston and became a part of the social circle of Boston, and he met young Vivia. In a few months of courting, it was evident that they loved each other, and so they became engaged, arranged the wedding. But shortly before the wedding, he fled without speaking to her personally. He just left her a note. She was hurt and she was angry. She found out that he had gone west and was an officer at the fort in Fort Gibson. Still hurt and wanting to see him again and let him know of her anger and her hurt and gain revenge. According to the legend, she realized she could not travel across country, which she planned to do as a young lady. It was too dangerous at that period of history. And so she cut off her long, beautiful hair, and she dressed as a young man. She arrived at the fort, according to the legend, burned from the sun and weary from traveling. The young recruit entered the army here at Fort Gibson and was not noticed by this young lieutenant. However, Vivia was watching him, and she would follow him at night as he left the fort and traveled to the home of his lady, the lady he was courting. Often she visited him or watched him as he visited his lady. But then she decided she would take her revenge. So one night she watched him as he rode off on his horse. She didn't follow him this night. She went back to the fort, procured her rifle, and waited in the trees that grew thickly near the fort. As he returned, she stepped out, she shot him off the horse. He fell, and as the legend says, he bled to death lying there on the ground. His body was found the next day. It was a great mystery at the fort. No one knew what happened to the young lieutenant. Some speculated he had shot himself, and some thought that from those trees it was probably an Indian that had stepped out and shot him. But time passed. The soldier was buried at the small cemetery there by the fort. However, Vivia's revenge turned to grief, and there were reports of a figure leaving the fort, going out to the cemetery, lying across a grave and crying and weeping in pain. And according to the legend, one cold morning in January, a body was found frozen across the grave of this young officer. Then people knew that we had a young lady instead of a young man. And then an old priest to whom Vivia had confessed her story. Then he solved the mystery and told of what had happened. Now one would think that the military men were angry that she murdered one of their officers, but they were not. The men admired her so much, it is said that the colonel at the fort wanted this stone prepared for her tomb, and that her name be engraved on it. Now, since that time, history has given us her last name, and there have been 2 tombstones, one with the name Vivia and one with the name Vivia Thomas, and a date for her birth. Again, one might say, there's no way a young woman could pass herself in a fort of could pass herself as a recruit in a fort of the 19th century. But others say, of course she could. Of course it was possible. And then there is always the evidence, because the gravestone is there, and the legend, which has to have a lot of truth in it, is still there. Joseph Bristow is the author of a book, The Tales of Old Fort Gibson. This young man came to Fort Gibson well over 100 years ago, at the end of the 19th century. But then, as an older man, towards the end of his life, he wrote this book, and it's memories of Fort Gibson and of the Indians in this territory. And he says here, a land that has no ruins has no memories. Old Fort Gibson, with its broken rafters, fallen masonry walls, grass-grown graves on the hilltop, and of evenings, white moving shapes of things that were. This is what I see every time I hear the name Fort Gibson. Someday I will return to the land of long ago and mingle for a short time with the shadows of things that were, before joining in my turn the eternity to come. Mr. Bristow says that he met Bess Howard when he was about 19 and she was about a year older. But she did not at first greet him and welcome him to her home, but at a later date she did. And Bess Howard was living in a home that was really the first home built in Fort Gibson around 1823, and it was a dragoon headquarters. But later it was the home of Dr. Howard and his daughter Bess. Now this home, according to Mr. Bristow, was built very elongated with a long porch on one side. And around the house were many tall trees, probably 100 years old or more. And he said these trees constantly cast shadows around the house. And so he called it the House of Shadows. But this house also, he said, on nights when the moon was shining brightly, he said that it reminded him of a silver illusion, and so he also called it the House of the Silver Moon. But he related a story that Bess had told him, how in the early days of this house, the first half of the 19th century, there had been a murder there in what we know as the living room. And in that room, there was an old fireplace with a stone mantel. There was an old puncheon floor, and there was an old handmade rug that covered it. And the rug was in front of the fireplace, covering a spot where blood had seeped into the floor from a murder that was committed there in the early days of the house. This house still stands in Fort Gibson, and the legends have continued to be told about it. In my family, I have a mother-in-law who related to me a story that she had experienced. Now, my mother-in-law is in her late 80s, but when she was just a girl, she lived across the lawn at what we know as the Adair home. And Miss Howard was very old and needed someone to sleep in her home at night and help her get her medicine for her. And so my mother-in-law, Juanita, told me that Miss Bess told her that at times the ghost, the man who committed the murder, returned to the home. And she said, Juanita, now don't be afraid. He will not hurt us. He will not come in my bedroom. You just look and listen and you will experience our ghost. Now, when one enters the home, there's a large hall, and to the right was Miss Bess Howard's bedroom. And then down the hall and to the left was this living room where the murder occurred. Juanita told me that one night she was asleep and suddenly she heard noise on the porch. She heard someone walking and she heard chains dragging. Now, Miss Howard had told her that the man was arrested and taken away in chains. Juanita said he came to the front door. The door opened. She heard him drag the chains. She said he paused at the bedroom door, which was open, but he did not enter. He went on to the living room, and he walked across the living room floor, the living area. She said she heard him stop for a period of time, and then she heard him go out the window, which Miss Howard said he always did. Miss Howard said that other people had died at this home, and that because of this period of history, you didn't bury them in a common cemetery. She said they were buried at the foot of the fireplace outside the home. And other people have said that at times they have seen images on the stone of that fireplace. That is the story of the House of Shadows. Now, Miss Howard lived there until she died. And I believe Mr. Bristow must have had a very fond place in his heart for her, because he tells in his book how he saved her letters that were 50 years old. And at the end of this story, he writes of Miss Bess again. He said he called the mayor of Fort Gibson to ask about her, and the mayor said she had been dead for about 10 years. And Miss Bess, who never married, is buried in the old Cherokee Cemetery here in Fort Gibson. And he writes of this in his book. The graves on the hill above the river were more numerous than they were years ago when I was in Fort Gibson. The moon was shining down over the old Neosho River. It was the same moon that had shone 50 years ago. And then it happened. A young girl in a white satin dress was standing before me just as she had appeared years ago one Sunday morning when she greeted me. And now she was here again, and she spoke to me. And she said, as she said before, truly, I believe we know one another well enough to speak, even after all these years. And then the moon on the distant horizon dropped into the cloud streamer, and when it appeared again, she was gone. There was nothing there at all but the silent, empty night. I know that the best authorities claim that the spirits of the dead never reappear, but my Indian friends claim that they do. And I do know that she appeared again to me that night, and that the Indians were right after all, because they generally are. So good night, my little Cherokee girl of the white satin dress standing in the moonlight of half a century ago, like a rose pressed between the leaves of an old book. You looked in for a few moments on the light of today, and then you returned to your yesterday. So good night. It will not be so very long before I will be going down that long, long trail with you again.